Ferrara, August 1510. Every bell in the city has gone quiet, not broken, silenced on purpose. Rome has placed the whole city under interdict. No mass, no sacraments, not one bell rung, for as long as this family keeps its throne. Outside the walls, banners are gathering, and the man riding at the front of that army is wearing armor over his robes, because Pope Julius II doesn't send other men to fight his wars. He leads them himself. Up on the wall, Duke Alfonso d'Este watches the banners multiply. Picture an aide turning to him. And I want to be up front. We don't have this conversation. Nobody wrote it down. This next part is invented. Saying something like, "Your Grace, the Holy Father has excommunicated you by name, stripped the church from this entire city. Maybe it's time to send word." And Alfonso doesn't turn around. "My family had this exact conversation 26 years ago," he says. "Different pope, different army, same wall. We're still standing here. He isn't." That line is invented too, but everything underneath it is real. In 1510, Pope Julius II excommunicated Alfonso d'Este by name, put all of Ferrara under interdict, and marched on the city himself. And the Duke, in this dramatization, is right about one thing. This wasn't the first time someone tried exactly this. So, that's the hook. And I told you the dialogue is made up. Here's the chapter underneath it, and it's real. A single paragraph, the shortest deep dive in the entire book, where Machiavelli explains why a family that's ruled somewhere long enough can survive almost anything thrown at it. He doesn't dwell on it. He doesn't need to. And the example he reaches for is exactly the siege I just described to you, except it's the second time it happened to this same family, not the first. To understand why he thinks one paragraph is enough to make that case, we need to back up to where this chapter sits in the book. Quick recap. Last chapter, Machiavelli drew his map. Every state is either a republic, governed by many, or a principality, ruled by one. He told us up front he's skipping republics, written about those elsewhere. Inside principalities, two flavors. Hereditary, where a family has ruled long enough that nobody remembers different, and new, where someone just took it. He said the new case is the hard one, the one he actually cares about, and that almost the entire rest of the book is going to be about it. Chapter 2 is where he clears the easy case off the table first. Hereditary rule, the kind where the throne was never really up for grabs in living memory. And he wants to show you, fast, why that case barely needs explaining, before he spends the rest of the book this chapter is answering, stated as plainly as Machiavelli states it. Why is it mechanically easier to hold power you inherited than power you took? Not, is it fair? He never asks that, not once in this chapter. The question is closer to engineering than ethics. What, structurally, makes an old throne harder to knock over than a new one? He answers it in two moves. Two sentences, really, once you strip out the example. And then he spends the rest of the paragraph just pointing at one family that happens to prove both moves at once. We'll take the two moves first, then go deep on the family, because the family's story is wilder than one sentence in a 500-year-old book lets on. First move. A natural prince has less cause and less necessity to give offense. Sit with that for a second, because it's doing more work than it looks like. A brand new ruler has to act. New taxes, because the treasury he inherited is somebody else's old arrangement. New loyalists installed in key posts, because he can't trust the previous regime's people. Old rivals dealt with, one way or another, because they remember a world where he wasn't in charge. Every single one of those moves creates an enemy. That's not bad luck. It's the job description of being new. A hereditary prince skips almost all of it. The tax system already exists, and people are used to it. The loyal officials are already loyal, because their families have always served this family. The rivals, if there ever were any, lost that argument generations ago. He's not being forced into the moves that make people hate a ruler, because the moves were already made by someone else, a long time before he was born. So, Machiavelli says, barring something else going wrong, people are simply inclined to like him. Not because he's earned their love this year, because nobody alive has a fresh reason to resent the arrangement he was handed. Second move, and this is the sharper one. Machiavelli's actual phrase for it, in the translation I'm reading from, is that any change in power leaves a toothing stone for further building. A toothing stone is a real construction term. It's the deliberately rough, jagged edge masons leave at the end of a wall, on purpose, so that the next section of wall has something to grip onto and lock into. Machiavelli is saying every disruption in power works the same way. The moment you change who's in charge, you leave a rough edge sticking out. And that edge is exactly what the next person who wants to disrupt things again will grab onto. A new ruler is, almost by definition, covered in those rough edges, because everything about his rule is recent and unfinished. But a family that's ruled somewhere for generations has had time to do something a new ruler never gets the chance to do: smooth every one of those edges flat. Nobody currently alive remembers the last disruption, so there's nothing left for a rival to grip. That's why longevity isn't sentimental in Machiavelli's telling. It's structural. The longer a family's been in power, the fewer toothing stones it's leaving exposed for somebody else to grab. Go deep on the family Machiavelli reaches for, because he gives it to you in one sentence, and the real story is much bigger. The House of Este, rulers of Ferrara, first siege, 1482 to 1484, a conflict historians call the War of Ferrara, or sometimes the Salt War, because it started over who controlled the salt trade at a place called Comacchio. The ruler at the time is Ercole I d'Este, and the men coming for him are Pope Sixtus IV, who genuinely hated Ercole personally, and Venice, which wanted that salt trade for itself. In November of 1482, Venetian troops crossed the Po River and lay siege to Ferrara directly. And here's where it gets interesting. Ercole doesn't win this through brilliance. He wins it through alliances his family had built over years. Naples sends troops under Alfonso of Calabria to invade the Papal States from the south and split the attackers' attention. Milan sends help. So does Mantua. So does Bologna. The war drags on for almost 2 years before both sides sign the Peace of Bagnolo in August of 1484. Ferrara loses some territory, a region called Rovigo, but the city and the family survive intact. And there's a detail historians note that's almost too good to be true. Pope Sixtus IV was so furious about the peace terms, he felt humiliated by them, that the rage reportedly brought on a physical collapse, and he died 5 days later. The pope who started the war didn't outlive it by a week. The family he tried to remove outlived him by generations. Now jump 26 years. The ruler of Ferrara is no longer Ercole. He died in 1505. It's his son, Alfonso I d'Este, and the man coming for him this time is Pope Julius II, the same warrior pope famous for personally leading troops in armor. Alfonso's family had spent decades tied to the King of France, and when Julius needed to punish France's allies in Italy, Ferrara was right there. In August of 1510, Julius does something his predecessor never did. He excommunicates Alfonso by name, places the entire city of Ferrara under interdict. No sacraments, no mass, the silence I described at the start, and personally marches troops against the city. This is part of a much larger, messier conflict historians call the War of the League of Cambrai, where the alliances kept flipping. Venice and the Pope had been enemies a few years earlier and were now, suddenly, on the same side, both with reasons to want Ferrara weakened. Alfonso does lose ground in this one. The cities of Modena in 1510 and Reggio 2 years later both slip out of his control. But Ferrara itself, the capital, the seat of the family, never falls. The war grinds on for years, until Julius II dies in February of 1513, 3 years after he started it, with Ferrara still standing and still ruled by the same family that was ruling it before he ever excommunicated anyone. 2 popes, 1 family, 26 years apart. Machiavelli compresses both of those wars into a single sentence and treats it like the same duke faced both fights. He didn't. It was a father, then a son. And that's actually the more interesting version of the story than the one he tells. Here's why that telescoping matters more than it looks like it should. If it really had been one man surviving 2 sieges 26 years apart, you could almost credit his personal skill. Maybe he just got good at this. But it wasn't one man. Ercole d'Este fought off the first siege. He died. His son inherited not just a title, but a whole accumulated weight of alliances, loyalty, and "we've always been the Estes." And that inheritance is what held when the second siege came, under a completely different ruler, facing a completely different pope. The thing that survived wasn't a skill passed from father to son. It was a structure, a family's standing in that specific place that didn't reset to 0 just because the man on the throne changed. That is Machiavelli's whole chapter, demonstrated by an example that's actually more extreme than he lets on. He's not telling you a hereditary prince that the position itself is hard to remove, almost independent of who's currently sitting in it. Now, here's the part it's easy to misread, and Machiavelli is careful, almost cold, about saying it directly. None of this is him claiming hereditary rulers are better people, or that bloodline earns loyalty. The goodwill a natural prince gets is borrowed from circumstance, not earned through virtue. And he states the limit on it explicitly. This holds unless extraordinary vices make him hated. A hereditary prince who's cruel enough, reckless enough, or careless enough can burn through generations of accumulated standing inside a single reign. The advantage isn't armor, it's a head start, the benefit of the doubt, handed to you before you've done a single thing to earn or lose it. And like any head start, it's entirely possible to run it all the way down to 0. Notice, too, what would have happened to the Este if either Ercole or Alfonso had actually been hated by their own people going into those sieges. No amount of inherited standing survives a population that's quietly hoping the invaders win. The toothing stones only stay smooth if you don't go around chipping new ones into the wall yourself. Here's why this still matters if you've never run a Renaissance duchy. Almost nothing about this mechanism is specific to kings. Mars, the candy company behind M&Ms and Snickers, has stayed privately controlled by the same family since 1911. Through wars, recessions, and competitors with far more outside investment, partly because nobody had to spend decades building the trust and internal loyalty that company already had baked in. Ford Motor Company nearly lost outside control multiple times over the past century, but the Ford family kept a special class of stock that preserved their voting power well beyond what their ownership percentage alone would justify. Accumulated structural standing, doing exactly the job Machiavelli describes. Long-running monarchies that have survived genuine scandal, abdications, affairs, controversies that would end an elected leader's career in a single news cycle, keep functioning afterward largely because the institution itself, not the individual wearing the crown that week, is what the public's loyalty was attached to all along. In every case, you're watching the same mechanism. Longevity manufactures trust, independent of whether anything happening right now has actually earned it. If you've inherited something, a company, a role, a reputation, you're not starting at 0. You're starting on credit you didn't personally build. And if you're the outsider trying to break in against someone who has that, you're not just fighting their resources. You're fighting the simple fact that nobody currently has a reason to want you to win. So go back to that wall for a second. Alfonso d'Este, watching banners gather outside Ferrara in 1510, under a silence Rome forced on his entire city. In the dramatization, he sounds calm because he's seen this before. In reality, he hadn't. His father had, 26 years earlier, against a different enemy entirely. What Alfonso actually had standing on that wall wasn't memory. It was 80-some years of his family simply being the answer to the question, who runs Ferrara? A question nobody in that city was currently asking, because it had been settled before most of them were born. That's not bravery. It's not genius. It's just an extremely long head start, arriving at exactly where it started. This was the easy case, and Machiavelli wanted you to feel how easy it is, on purpose, before he takes the floor out from under you. Because everything that made this chapter short, the accumulated trust, the smoothed over edges, the head start nobody had to earn, disappears completely in chapter 3. That's where new principalities show up, territory bolted onto an existing state, none of the inherited goodwill, every single move a gamble, and a name you're about to hear a lot for the rest of this book. Cesare Borgia, who had none of what the Este family had, and had to build a state's worth of loyalty from absolutely nothing, in real time, with everyone watching for the first mistake. Ferrara's walls held because of 80 years nobody had to think about. Borgia doesn't get 80 years. He doesn't even get 8. Chapter 2 was the calm water. Chapter 3 is where Machiavelli starts teaching you what happens when there's none. Chapter 2 of Machiavelli's The Prince is 1 paragraph long, and inside that 1 paragraph is the story of a single family surviving 2 separate sieges, 26 years apart, under 2 different popes. We open with a dramatized, Creeley invented, scene at the second siege, then dig into the real history Machiavelli compresses into 1 sentence. The 1482-84 War of Ferrara, the 1510 excommunication of Alfonso d'Este, and why the Duke of Ferrara, Machiavelli describes, was actually 2 different men, a father and a son. This is a longer, deeper dive cut of Chapter 2 than our usual format. Cold open, dramatized. Ferrara under interdict, 1510. What's real and what's invented. Where we are. Recap of Chapter 1. This chapter's actual question. Move 1. Why a hereditary prince offends less. Move 2. The toothing stone, and why disruption leaves an edge. Deep dive. The 1482-84 War of Ferrara. Deep dive. The 1510 excommunication and siege. The twist, it was 2 men, not 1. What this chapter is not saying. Why this still matters today. Back to the wall. Bridge to Chapter 3, Cesare Borgia.